The third of the Illustrious-class armored carriers, HMS Victorious is arguably the most fortunate member of the class. Her entry into service was delayed by changing wartime needs for materials, but when she actually entered service, she managed to participate in some of the most important British carrier actions of the war, while more or less dodging severe damage. Where her sisters were either pounded by the Luftwaffe or warped into a twisted mess by the Japanese, or in one case by plain accident, Victorious managed to dodge all of that. She was damaged in combat, but it was pretty minor damage, all things being equal. As a direct result, she would be the last of the class to endure. She would end up lasting until the end of the 1960s, following an extensive rebuild. A rebuild that rivals, if not exceeds, the famous Italian ones in regards to being basically a new ship. A rebuild so expensive that it led to her remaining sisters missing out on refits because Victorious cost so much. Was that refit worth the time and money? Well, that's an interesting question. This video is going to focus on Victorious and her wartime service, but I will be dedicating Sunday's video to her rebuild and post-rebuild service. It is something I feel deserving of its own video instead of trying to lump it in here. With that in mind, let's get into her wartime service. As mentioned, Victorious was the third of the Illustrious-class carriers. These were the prototypical British armored carrier, designed to be more survivable in operations where land-based air power was to be expected, as well as being built to the weight limits of the Second London Naval Treaty, limiting the ships to 23,000 tons. While I will go into more detail on the design process of these ships when I cover Illustrious herself, I will note that this was largely a doctrine choice. American carrier design was about the largest air wing possible. Thus you have large, open hangars and deck parks in the American case. This gave much larger strike packages at the cost that the flight deck was vulnerable to even light bombs, though with the caveat that it was far easier to repair any damage, or at the least patch it over. British concept, concerned about land-based air power and also with the idea of the hangar being a protected area, rejected that idea. They accepted a smaller air wing in favor of ships that could, in theory, take heavier damage and keep on trucking, though their armored deck was more like an armored box that covered the important bits. For more detail on this, I would recommend Drax's video on the pros and cons of each concept, though I will cover it myself at a later date. Moving on to Victorious, she was laid down by Vickers Armstrong on May 4th, 1937. Her launch would follow a bit over 2 years later, on September 14th, 1939. As World War II in Europe had kicked off by this point, her fitting out process would prove to be rather protracted in nature. Britain was facing a sharp need for Atlantic convoy escorts, and Victorious would have to wait for, among other things, armor plate. Kinda important for an armored carrier, no? In any case, Victorious would finally commission on May 14th, 1941. This is an interesting date, considering that just 2 weeks after she entered service, Victorious was doing much the same as Prince of Wales, charging off after the threat of Bismarck breaking into the Atlantic, in spite of being very new. In Victorious's case, so new the paint had hardly dried. So new, in fact, that she only carried a scratch air wing a quarter the size of her already small normal complement. Some Fulmars and Swordfish, and nothing else. In spite of this, Victorious would still launch an attack on Bismarck in the aftermath of Denmark Strait. While Ark Royal, justifiably, gets the fame for crippling Bismarck, it would be Victorious that hit her first. Her pilots, about as new as the ship herself, charged in through rough weather and anti-aircraft fire to launch a torpedo attack on Bismarck. While only one torpedo would end up hitting, and this hit more or less on the best protected part of the ship, it did do some good. The torpedo itself did minor damage. The maneuvering Bismarck did to avoid the torpedoes loosened her repairs to the damage she took from Prince of Wales, leading to one of her boiler rooms flooding, which slowed Bismarck down yet more. Unfortunately for Victorious, she would play no further part in this operation. It would be Ark Royal that crippled Bismarck and left her vulnerable to the surface ships that would ultimately sink her. Following this, Victorious would largely be relegated to convoy escort duties and the odd strike on German bases in Scandinavia. These would include the occasional break to try and get a strike in on Bismarck's sister, Tirpitz, though that ship would prove more fortunate at avoiding carrier planes at sea. Interestingly enough, in October 1941, Victorious was deployed to block Admiral Scheer and Tirpitz from breaking into the Atlantic based on cracked Enigma messages. This is to be expected, but the interesting thing is that she had support in the Denmark Strait from King George V and USS Idaho and Mississippi, alongside the cruisers USS Wichita and Tuscaloosa. You'll note this is before December 7th, 1941. America was not formally at war, and most assuredly was not formally at war with Germany. Goes to show just how keen Roosevelt was to get in a tussle with Germany, doesn't it? As it would turn out, the German operation was cancelled, and we didn't get to see Tirpitz start America's World War II before Japan had the chance to. An interesting what-if, perhaps, but as for Victorious, she returned back to the same duties with the home fleet that she had already been performing. In fact, she would do so until March of 1942, at which point she returned to the freezing Arctic for convoy protection duty. In the course of this, her planes would end up shadowing Tirpitz on March 7th. While a torpedo attack would be launched, a combination of poor weather and inexperienced crews led to all the torpedoes missing. This would be a great missed opportunity, as Tirpitz would never again be caught at sea quite like that. Then again, she wouldn't be caught like that because she was more or less ordered to never sail if a British carrier was known to be nearby. So in that regard, one can argue Victorious succeeded in a way. When the infamous PQ-17 debacle cancelled Arctic convoys for a bit, though, Victorious would leave the frozen north for the sunny Mediterranean. In this case to join Operation Pedestal, a last-ditch attempt to get Malta properly supplied and defended. In this, Victorious joined her half-sister Indomitable, along with the much older group of Furious, Eagle, and Argus for training. The actual operation would see Argus left behind, while Furious would do a concurrent but separate operation. As such, Victorious, Eagle, and Indomitable would be the carriers in the main force. Victorious would end up being the most fortunate of the three. She took only slight damage from Italian bombers, while her half-sister took far more severe damage that left her unable to operate her aircraft and would put her out of action for repairs until February of 1943. Eagle, meanwhile, was sunk by a German U-boat, U-73. As the ship to escape major damage, Victorious would see a small refit and then return to action. Specifically, Operation Torch. Here she would join USS Ranger in providing air support for the Allied landings, including a somewhat famous incident where her Wildcats accepted the surrender of a Vichy French airfield by means of landing at it when they noticed white flags. Her most interesting service to come, though, was when she was sent off to join the United States Pacific Fleet. This wouldn't seem much in the way of actual action, yet it is an interesting side story to her service. You see, after the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, the USN was down to two operational fleet carriers. One in the Pacific, USS Saratoga, and one in the Atlantic, USS Ranger. With the Navy having, understandably, decided that Ranger was unfit for Pacific combat duty, as well as the Essex-class still a bit away from service, a request was made. A request that I'm sure absolutely burned Admiral King to make, considering he hated everyone in general, but he really, really, really hated the British. Or so the popular conception is, though as is usual in history, the truth is a bit more nuanced than that. That request being, pretty please, can we borrow one of your fleet carriers? Victorious would be the carrier loaned to the USN, setting off for the Pacific. On the way there, she would pick up Avengers and more Wildcats, along with such things as American work uniforms. Those apparently proving popular enough that they became British standard as well, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. Now, all that being said, before I cover what she actually did in the Pacific, it is worth countering a common misconception here. People, and this includes her wiki page, like calling Victorious during this period USS Robin. This is inaccurate. She was never formally designated such, nor did she formally join the USN. What actually happened was that Victorious got the radio call sign Robin. She remained HMS Victorious on loan and not a formal part of the United States Navy. This has been warped since then into USS Robin, the carrier that didn't exist, or what have you. While there was a certain tongue-in-cheek thing during the war to respond as USS Robin, it was, again, not a formal designation. A joking one at best. That tangent aside, Victorious would join up with Saratoga in the Solomons in May 1943. This was not entirely an altruistic move on the part of the Royal Navy, themselves hurting for fleet carriers. This was to learn how to operate in an environment far different from their usual hunting grounds. A win-win, as it were. Her operations here would, in the end, largely be that kind of thing. Experience gained in a new area, but not extensive combat duty. Most of the time Victorious spent with Saratoga amounted to training in cross-deck operations and shore bombardment. As just one example, it was discovered early on that Saratoga was better at operating Avengers, which were on the edge of too big for an Illustrious to easily operate, and Victorious was better at operating Wildcats, due in large part to having more advanced fighter direction facilities. The result of this would be an experimental trade. Saratoga would become a strike carrier, only having enough fighters for self-defense, while operating all of the strike aircraft. Victorious, meanwhile, would be a fighter carrier, taking on most of the Wildcats. In this, both ships would prove successful. The operations showed great promise, and had they entered proper combat, would likely have benefited both carriers. As it was, Victorious would largely be relegated to supporting shore strikes. The Japanese held their carriers back during this period. So while Victorious would fly something like 600 sorties, these would be relatively mundane affairs. Come the end of July 1943, Victorious was recalled back to the Royal Navy. She left behind her Avengers as spares for Saratoga, and returned home by the end of the year. Her following service is, well, in a lot of ways a bit more generic. She would be in refit until March 1944, returning back to service and convoy escorts. In April, she would join Furious and assorted escort carriers in launching an attack on Tirpitz, still being a general menace in Norwegian waters. This attack, Operation Tungsten, hit Tirpitz 14 times and did some serious damage to her superstructure. It did not, however, sink her. Put her out of action for a few months, certainly, but Tirpitz remained stubbornly afloat. Follow-on attacks were cancelled due to bad weather and never took place. As a result, Tirpitz would eventually be finished off by Lancasters and tallboy bombs. Victorious missed her chance to finish off Bismarck's sister due to being sent back to fight Japan with Indomitable in June 1944. This time she joined the Eastern Fleet out of Ceylon instead of the USN. As operations in Europe began to wear down, at least on the naval front, the British were routing ships east against Japan. In concert with Indomitable and her big sister Illustrious, Victorious raided Japanese holdings up and down the Dutch East Indies. Multiple strikes to oil facilities would further cripple Japan's ability to get desperately needed fuel, as some of those facilities wouldn't be repaired to full capacity until after the end of the war. In spite of her general luck to this point, though, Victorious had to go to India for repairs to her steering gear. Evidently, she had picked up some steering issues during her Indies adventures, though those were fairly minor all told. After those repairs were done, Victorious would join up with the newly formed British Pacific Fleet. Following training and workup, and further repairs that lasted until January, Victorious returned to action in early 1945. Action of much the same kind, consisting of further raids on Japanese-held territory. This would change when she, along with other British carriers, joined in the operations off Okinawa. Here, Victorious would continue to be rather lucky in comparison to her sisters. While Formidable would be absolutely savaged by kamikaze hits during these operations, Victorious fared notably better. True enough, she was hit by kamikazes herself, but those ended up being the infamous hit and bounce off the armored deck kind of hits. Her lift took some minor damage, as well as her superstructure, but it was nothing like the fire that permanently warped her sister. The last action she would perform in World War II, after repairs from the Okinawa damage, involved sailing up and down Japan's coast. Her planes crippled the escort carrier Kaio, but the biggest targets were left to the Americans, which was probably a political thing. While Victorious was set to support the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the atomic bombs meant that this never came to pass. Instead, Victorious, still having Warspite-like steering issues, returned to Australia and then on to Britain. This is where her wartime service comes to an end. Her post-war service, well, as I said at the start, this is something that really needs its own video. I'll be ending this video here and covering her refit in Sunday's video, along with her post-rebuild service. I do think it really deserves its own video, as the ship that came out of the rebuild was, in many ways, a new ship built on old bones. As such, as I end things here, thank you for those who stuck around to the end. If you're interested at all in Vicky's rebuild and post-war service, consider subscribing, if you aren't already, and sticking around for the Sunday video. I hope to see you all there.